Havana, Cuba, September 9, 1985. Four female nurses stepped off a Vedado sidewalk. They walked into a Soviet-watched apartment building. Their badges read PAHO 985. Everyone noticed the wigs and lipstick, and the white coats looked almost theatrical. But nobody searched the medical bags, because Havana was hunting armed men, not emergency responders. Inside that building were four celebrated Cuban intelligence officers the CIA had chased for 18 months. In the next 16 minutes, Washington would either prove restraint or write a new rule with blood. Operation Nightingale. In the mid-1980s, U.S.-Cuba hostility was not theoretical. It was procedural. It lived in file cabinets, radio intercept logs, and the kind of meetings where nobody used names. It also lived in public humiliation, because in a secret war, the only scoreboard that mattered was who looked in control. The wound that mattered here was an incident Americans inside the system described as the Homefront Strike. In the legend, it was a bombing tied to Cuban DGI tradecraft. It killed Americans and embarrassed an institution built on certainty. Public records did not clearly confirm the incident as described. That absence became part of the pressure. When a story existed in fragments, denials, whispers, and one-line references in restricted cables, it created a different kind of anger. Not just grief, disbelief. Within Langley, that ambiguity had a cold effect. It removed the usual guardrails. If the incident could not be argued in court, it could not be answered in court. If it could not be named publicly, it could not be answered publicly. That was the first operational tension, and it arrived early. It meant any response would be built for deniability, not applause. It also meant the response would be judged internally by a single metric. Did it restore deterrence without triggering a crisis that burned through control? And control mattered, because the island was not alone. The Soviet presence was not a rumor. It was proximity. Advisors, equipment, and a security culture shaped by the expectation of sabotage. Havana's paranoia was not a personality trait. It was a survival method. What the CIA faced was not simply a hostile service. It faced a counterintelligence ecosystem designed to turn intrusions into theater. Cuba's DGI had a long record of catching, flipping, and showcasing intruders. Washington's covert pressure on Havana had an equally long record of producing blowback. In this environment, accountability was not a legal term. It was a strategic one. By late 1984, analysts began to describe a specific problem set. Four DGI officers were living openly in Havana as heroes. Their visibility was their armor. They attended receptions. They held positions that came with protection. They were celebrated because the regime wanted them seen. That was the paradox. If they were truly valuable, they were also predictable. The CIA did not need to prove they existed. It needed to decide what their existence meant. If these four were tied, directly or indirectly, to the alleged Homefront Strike, then letting them retire safely created an incentive structure. It told adversaries that distance, borders, and ceremony could wash away consequences. Deterrence is often described as a threat. In practice, it is a lesson. The lesson Washington wanted to teach was simple. You could not strike at home and then become untouchable. That lesson still had to fit reality. Extradition was impossible. Diplomacy was toothless. A loud raid on a surveillance-heavy island risked a public crisis that would hand Havana a propaganda victory and invite Moscow to posture. Traditional options failed on paper, which is where secret wars are usually decided. So planners reached for a doctrine that did not look like doctrine from the outside. Inside the system, it carried a bureaucratic name: the Deniable Retaliation Protocol. One internal routing sheet later referred to it as Directive DCI 1875, a shorthand that made it feel administrative instead of violent. The logic was straightforward. If accountability could not travel through law, it would travel through fear, without fingerprints. This operation fit that doctrine for one reason. It could be framed as crime, chaos, or internal betrayal. The method would not announce itself as American. The desired effect would still land. Three obstacles made the scenario look impossible. First, the island's surveillance density was not hypothetical. Neighborhood watch committees, uniformed police, and plainclothes security overlapped by design. Movement patterns were noticed because boredom is a sensor. Second, Cuba's security culture was trained to expect men with guns. The threat profile was gendered. It was visual. It was built around haircuts, boots, and posture. Third, Soviet-era protection layers surrounded sensitive housing. Some buildings were watched not because they were glamorous, but because they were nodes. Places where officers lived, met, and moved. A building in Vedado could be ordinary in architecture and extraordinary in attention. Despite these challenges, planners identified an opportunity. It was not a gadget. It was a human weakness. The targets were protected by an assumption: nobody would come dressed as care. Within 72 hours, all elements would be in position. But first, one critical element needed to be resolved. The team had to carry a cover story so emotionally compelling that Cuban security would choose speed over suspicion. That cover was built on public health. In that period, rumor moved faster than official statements. Disease did not need to be real to create compliance. People feared infection because they could not negotiate with it. They could not arrest it. They could only manage it. So the legend became Pan American Emergency Medical Staff responding to a suspected outbreak. It was simple enough to repeat under stress. It sounded international enough to justify paperwork. It also created a liability problem for any guard who delayed them. In the story the team would tell, delay was the crime. The targets mattered, but they were not the only humans in the room. One intercepted communication from late August of 1985 humanized the problem in a way analysts did not expect. According to an internal translation summary marked SIGINT extract, Island Desk, one of the four targets spoke to a family member about a child's fever and a missed school recital. The content had nothing operationally relevant. It was banal. It also proved the target was not a monster 24 hours a day. When the consequence arrived, that banality would be part of the moral damage. The operatives had their own humanity, and it was less comforting. The person assigned as lead talker had been selected for control, not aggression. In one training note, a handler described the operative as calm under denial, meaning the operative stayed steady when a lie was challenged. That strength carried a known risk. During cover operations, calm can slide into belief. During final rehearsals, the lead talker experienced what handlers called legend drift, the psychological blurring when the false identity felt more real than the original. It surfaced in small, operational ways. The operative corrected another team member's patient language, not as performance, but as instinct. The operative adjusted a coat collar in a mirror and felt a flash of pride, then resentment, then disgust, because the disguise worked too well. In the post-operation debrief, the assessment recorded a single line. Subject displayed transient identity convergence. No mission impact. It sounded clinical. It was not. But the mission continued. By September 9, 1985, the operation entered its execution phase. The trigger event was confirmation that all 4 targets would be in one building that night. The window was 16 minutes, and the first minute would decide the last. The operation's architecture was designed to look ordinary. It did not rely on cinematic stealth. It relied on paperwork, posture, and the expectation that people behave differently around medicine. The documents were the first layer. The team carried identity cards that used institutional language rather than personal detail. The names were plausible, but the real power came from the stamps. One credential was labeled PAHO 985. Another carried a secondary authorization line, Field Authorization SEP9. A third document, thin paper with a heavy seal, referenced a fabricated directive number, Circular 4-21, Outbreak Response. The point was not authenticity under forensic review. The point was authority in a hallway under bad light, while someone's neighbor whispered the word diphtheria. Everything about the paperwork was built to end conversations, not start them. The equipment reinforced the story without teaching the method. The medical bags were deliberately heavy, but the visible contents were innocuous. A stethoscope sat on top. A roll of gauze sat near the zipper. 2 labeled vials were positioned where a guard's eyes would land first. Beneath that layer, the weight was different. Not exotic, not theatrical. Just enough to end the job quickly if the disguise failed. The communication system was equally plain. The team used short burst check-ins timed to prevent chatter. A compact handheld radio, an off-the-shelf Motorola MX series unit, was carried for redundancy. But the primary method was simpler. Pre-arranged time calls and a voice loop that could be reached if anyone dialed the PAHO contact number. The number routed to a recorded message that sounded like a tired bureaucrat. It was designed to buy seconds, not win debates. Escape routes were planned like insurance policies. The preferred path was a quiet exit from Vedado toward the coast, then east toward Kojimar, where a small craft could blend with routine movement. The fallback path moved west, toward a pre-selected intersection near a bus depot, where crowd density could become cover. A final contingency assumed failure and arrest, and it included a cover story that did not collapse into confession. The team itself was built as roles, not personalities. Surveillance specialists established pattern-of-life confirmation and tracked the building's guard shifts. A logistics cell handled documentation, wardrobe, and the medical props. The execution team was 4 people, each with a task that could be described in one sentence. Lead talker controlled the room. Door control owned thresholds and prevented surprises. Comms handled timed check-ins and cover reinforcement. Clean exit kept the path open and protected the retreat. Compartmentalization was strict. Each operative knew only the immediate slice of the plan needed to perform their role, to prevent a single compromise from exposing the full route, the full cover, or the full chain of custody. The planning consumed 6 weeks. By early September, the final rehearsal milestone had been achieved. The team had 48 hours before the next phase. They used that time to do nothing heroic and everything boring. They slept. They ate bland food. They rehearsed one sentence until it sounded annoyed instead of memorized. What the targets did not know was that their protection had become a calendar. September 9th, 1985. At 1930 hours, the building in Vedado followed its usual rhythm. A guard smoked, a resident carried groceries, a radio played low behind a door. This was not a fortress in appearance. That was part of the danger. Places that look normal invite normal behavior. Over the next 90 minutes, the operation tightened. Surveillance confirmed the target's arrival. One came in first, unhurried, carrying a folder, Another arrived with a companion and separated at the door. The third and fourth arrived within the same short interval, suggesting coordination, not coincidence. The conclusion was simple. The targets were together and relaxed. What they did not know was that relaxation is a signature. At 21:15 hours, the execution team left its staging point. The movement was not fast. It was administrative. They carried the medical bags with the kind of practiced inconvenience that workers have when they are carrying responsibility, not danger. A micro hook held the entire phase together. The method about to be used was not invisibility. It was visibility. At 21:40 hours, they turned onto the block. The building's entrance light washed the sidewalk in a thin, unflattering glow. It was the kind of light that makes people look guilty. The team did not fight that. They leaned into it. Guilty is one interpretation. Exhausted is another. At 21:47 hours, the team entered the lobby. The guard's first question was not, "Who are you?" It was, "Why?" Guards in that environment were trained to screen intruders, but they were also trained to avoid blame. The lead talker gave a sentence designed to short-circuit debate. "If this is diphtheria, delay is the crime." The guard looked at the paperwork. His eyes went to the stamp. The stamp mattered more than the face. The stamp suggested an institution larger than him. That was the real coercion. Two complications nearly collapsed the cover inside the first minute. The first complication was a resident who insisted on calling a supervisor. It was not bravery. It was habit. People in controlled societies learn that paper can be forged, but supervisors can punish. The comms operator stepped forward with a clipped phrase and a second credential card. The operator did not argue. The operator offered a solution. "You can call. You should call. Use this number. Put it on speaker." The resident dialed. The line rang once and then answered with a rehearsed voicemail loop. It sounded official, annoyed, and bored. It did not explain. It instructed. The resident heard what they needed to hear. Not truth, but permission. The second complication was worse. An unexpected visitor appeared in the stairwell. Not a guard, not a resident with groceries. A man with the posture of habit. He paused too long. He looked at hands, shoes, and how people held weight. The bystander's gaze moved to the wigs and then to the medical bags. It stayed there. A second more and the spell would break. The team's solution was not violence. It was performance. The lead talker softened the voice and raised the triage checklist where the bystander could see it. The checklist was not detailed. It was a prop with boxes and the word "contacts" written in block letters. The bystander saw what looked like a process. Process is comforting. Process is how institutions disguise fear. The lead talker asked a question that made the bystander part of the solution. "Which unit did you come from? We need a contact list." The bystander answered reflexively, not because it was true, but because it was easier than resisting. He mumbled a floor number and kept moving. The window opened when the target's apartment door unlocked, because medics were invited inside. At 21:52 hours, the team reached the correct floor. The hallway smelled like old paint and cooking oil. The kind of smell that makes a place feel lived in, not defended. Door control positioned near the stairwell, not aggressively, but in a way that made the body a gate without looking like a gate. It was a mundane geometry. It was also total control. What the targets did not know was that room geometry is fate. At 21:56 hours, the apartment door opened. A woman inside spoke first. Her tone carried irritation, not fear. That tone was another confirmation. The targets felt safe enough to be annoyed. The lead talker introduced the team as if time was already short. The cover story was repeated in the same words used in rehearsals, but it was delivered with a detail that made it sound spontaneous. A reference to a suspected cluster and 2 symptomatic contacts on the block. It was the kind of jargon civilians hear on the news and do not fully understand, which is exactly why it works. The team entered. Inside the apartment, the targets were not lined up like villains. They were men in a room that looked like a room. Chairs, a table, papers. One target held a cup. Another leaned against a wall as if he had done it 1,000 times. The operatives spread naturally, like nurses would. One moved toward a sink, as if to wash hands. One positioned near a chair, as if to take notes. One remained near the doorway, as if to manage airflow. Door control did not block the exit. Door control simply owned the threshold with a foot position, and a clipboard held at chest height. The clipboard was a prop with a purpose. It created a barrier without looking like a weapon. At 21:58 hours, the lead talker began the questions. The questions were designed for 2 outcomes. If the target stayed compliant, the team could maintain close distance without triggering suspicion. If the targets became hostile, the team would already be positioned. The questions were not medical in content. They were medical in rhythm. Short, calm, repetitive. Any intelligence service would recognize the deeper technique. It was tempo control. The person asking questions sets the pace. The person answering follows. What the targets did not know was that they were being paced into stillness. At 22:01 hours, the first target made a mistake. He laughed. It was not a big laugh. It was a dismissive sound that said, without words, "This is not serious." That dismissal was the psychological vulnerability the operation required. It meant the targets did not shift into threat posture. They did not scan the room. They did not test the door. They remained men in their own home, listening to nurses. The lead talker requested that everyone remain seated to reduce exposure. The sentence sounded plausible. It also turned bodies into predictable angles. The operative internal rule, no hero moves, held them to restraint. The mission did not require domination. It required timing. At 22:04 hours, a target reached for a cigarette. That motion, hand to pocket, could have been nothing. It could also have been the beginning of collapse if a weapon appeared. The operative nearest the table used a simple interruption, an offered mask. The mask was a prop, paper-thin, meaningless against true disease. It was meaningful against reflex. The target took it, irritated, and put it down. His hand left his pocket. The moment passed. The method was psychological, not mechanical. The best cover is the role people are emotionally incentivized to believe. In that room, everyone was incentivized to believe medicine, because medicine created a path back to normal life. At 22:07 hours, comms made the first time check-in. It was a 2-word phrase into the radio, not a conversation. The words were meaningless outside the plan. Inside, they confirmed that the hallway remained quiet and the building entrance had not erupted. While the execution team controlled the room, 2 miles away, a separate element moved into position. It was the exfil asset. Waiting near the coastline, engine silent, lights off. The driver watched a wristwatch and did not move. In covert work, patience is not a virtue. It is a requirement. At 22:08 hours, the targets were fully contained by expectation. One target asked an operationally dangerous question, but he did not know it. "Who sent you?" If asked by a suspicious guard, The question could have been fatal. Asked by a man who still believed he was dealing with bureaucracy, it became manageable. The lead talker answered with a truth-shaped lie. The ministry asked for speed. They asked for silence. It landed because it matched the culture. Speed and silence were believable. They were also ironic. At 22:10 hours, the team shifted from questioning to the final phase. The transition was not dramatic. It was clinical. It was the moment when performance ended and consequence began. The violence, when it arrived, was described later in the same way professionals describe catastrophic failure, as outcomes, not emotion. The method resulted in immediate incapacitation. One target attempted to stand and did not complete the motion. Another reached for the doorway and was stopped before the threshold. There were no shouted speeches, no prolonged struggle. The operation had been designed to prevent spectacle. Elapsed time from initiation to completion was under 2 minutes. The room went quiet in a way that does not happen in ordinary life. It was the kind of quiet that makes a human brain search for an explanation and find none. At 22:12 hours, it was over. The team executed the exit plan exactly as rehearsed. The medical bags were closed. The coats were adjusted. The lead talker spoke one final sentence into the room, not for the targets, but for the operatives. It was a phrase that marked the mental boundary between cover and reality. Outbreak contained. Then they moved. At 22:13 hours, door control opened the door and scanned the hallway. The hallway remained ordinary. Ordinary is the best possible outcome after an extraordinary act. At 22:14 hours, the team walked, not ran, toward the stairs. In the stairwell, the earlier bystander reappeared, coming up slowly. He saw the white coats again. He saw faces that looked tired. He saw medical bags. His brain reached for the easiest story. He stepped aside. What he did not know was that his kindness was part of the operation. At 22:16 hours, the team exited the building lobby. The guard glanced up. The lead talker gave him the look of a worker who is late and annoyed. The guard's eyes went again to the stamp. The stamp remained the authority. The team stepped into the street. Outside, the city did not erupt instantly. Cities rarely do. They absorbed shock in delayed waves. Within 8 minutes, the first alarm began to move through the building. A neighbor heard something wrong. A door remained open longer than it should. A call went unanswered. By 22:25 hours, Cuban security forces began to mobilize in the way systems mobilize, through routine. Calls up a chain, units dispatched, checkpoints prepared. This was the second major paradox of Operation Nightingale. Havana mobilized hard, but it mobilized in the wrong direction. The descriptions that traveled first were shaped by expectation. Authorities searched for men. They searched for heavy boots and military haircuts. They searched vehicles for weapons, not medical props. They watched the docks for raiders, not responders. The operation exploited that bias without celebrating it. While Havana searched for men, 4 figures in white coats moved toward the coast, staying inside the patterns of evening foot traffic. They did not cut through empty streets. They moved where witnesses would be plentiful, because in a crowded environment, individual memory becomes unreliable. At 22:40 hours, the team reached a pre-selected intersection. Clean exit signaled the shift to the next segment of the plan. The signal was not a flare or a dramatic gesture. It was a mundane action, pausing to adjust a bag strap. That pause aligned the team with a passing vehicle that had been selected for its normalcy. The vehicle did not speed. It did not look tactical. It looked like a car that belonged to someone's uncle. At 22:50 hours, the vehicle turned away from Vedado. 2 miles behind them, the building's internal crisis was now external. Uniforms appeared. Doors were knocked. The guard's cigarette was dropped and crushed by a nervous foot. Someone asked the first question that mattered. How did they get inside? The answer would not be said out loud at first, because it was unbearable for a security culture built on threat detection. They walked in. At 23:10 hours, checkpoints began to harden. Cuban forces canvassed streets and watched buses. They focused on docks and roads that would move a raiding party out of the city. They looked for bulk. They looked for flight. The team used the opposite. They moved in the direction that looked least like escape. They took turns that suggested routine. They did not accelerate at checkpoint sight. They did not attempt to talk their way through with bravado. They behaved like people who had nothing to hide. At 23:30 hours, the team reached the coastal rendezvous sector. The exfil asset was waiting near Kojimar, where small craft movement could be ordinary, and where a shoreline could offer quick separation from street-level pursuit. The transfer was short and silent. No shouted commands, no dramatic engine roar. Within minutes, the craft moved into dark water. The extraction route assumed that Cuba's first instinct would be to look for invasion, not departure by anonymity. The craft stayed low and avoided showing a signature that would trigger attention. The water did not care about ideology. It cared about noise and light. By 00:15 hours on September 10, 1985, the team was no longer in Havana. The city, however, was still in the operation. Inside Havana, the breach became a strategic wound, not just because 4 officers were dead, because they had been reachable, because protection had failed in the one place it was supposed to be absolute: at home. By dawn on September 10, 1985, Cuban authorities understood a foreign act had occurred. They did not need forensics to feel it. They needed only to see the pattern: precision, speed, and the absence of a believable local motive. The first evidence was mundane. An open door, a neighbor's report of unfamiliar voices, footsteps timed too cleanly. The scene offered little that could be traced. Every lead ended in dead ends, suggesting a sophistication level designed to deny attribution rather than celebrate capability. Officially, the incident was framed in the language states use when they want options. It could be described as criminal violence or foreign terrorism. The flexibility mattered. It allowed Havana to choose retaliation without committing to a story it could not prove. Privately, the act was treated as something sharper, a breach of sovereignty that demanded retribution. Cuban security blanketed Vedado with checkpoints and canvassed the coastline for raiders. Early descriptions were still anchored to expectation: male intruders, military posture, heavy boots. That misalignment delayed the most important realization. The cover had been the weapon. In Washington, the denials were automatic. They were also not the point. In the intelligence world, denials are often transparent to those in the field. Transparency is tolerated because deniability is functional. It keeps escalation controllable. Strategically, the outcome was double-edged. Tactically, the objective was accomplished. The 4 targets were eliminated in their protected environment. The operation proved reach. It demonstrated that geographic safety was conditional. Strategically, the cost arrived in layers. Cuba's counterintelligence posture hardened. Surveillance expanded. Internal suspicion became policy. That kind of expansion catches spies, but it also catches ordinary people. It creates purges, not just prosecutions. According to a post-operation assessment circulated within a restricted compartment, The agency's internal conclusion was blunt. Deterrent effect achieved. Counterintelligence backlash expected and acceptable. The calculation was that the benefits outweighed the costs because the primary audience was not Havana. It was everyone watching Havana. Whether that proved correct would become clear over the following years, as the island's security culture grew more rigid and as the United States faced its own long-term corrosion. The normalization of revenge as operational policy. The moral damage was not abstract. The disguise had a special toxin. It used medical identity as camouflage. It turned public health trust into a tactical asset. Even people who agreed with the target set could see the contamination. That is the paradox at the heart of Operation Nightingale. One side called it justice. 4 alleged perpetrators living as heroes were stopped when courts and diplomacy could not touch them. The other side called it assassination. A powerful state crossed borders, hid behind medicine, and treated sovereignty as an inconvenience. The answer revealed more about the viewer's worldview than about the targets. If the targets were guilty, but the only way to reach them was an illegal, deniable hit. Was Operation Nightingale justice, or a crime that poisoned everything it touched? Drop your take in the comments. If this story made you reconsider where deterrence ends and law begins, hit like, share it, and subscribe for the next briefing.